In just a second. I got a couple quick follow-ups. Stay up here, John, too. A few things. One, Joe has provided some practical next steps that the faith community can do on this issue of racial justice, in particular pastoral care and counseling. I also just want to put a plug in. If folks want to know how to combine the quantitative with the practical, particularly in this issue of connecting people to jobs, even survivors and so forth, you need to reach out to Joe Jones. You need to hire Joe Jones as a consultant. You need to do whatever you need to do to get in his head. He's one of the smartest people I know and has done this stuff in such a practical way. I also, people throw out this notion of, I had a tough life and I turned it around. I'd encourage you to really dig into Joe's story. It's not just kind of one of those pat, I turned things around kind of story. It's a truly human story of triumph that is not just his, but it's a model for what is possible with all the men and women that we are all working with around the country and around the world. Check out the Fight for Black Men where we talk about Joe. Joe, I want to ask you one question about that story, and it's about the turnaround point. So Joe, his father left when he was 9. He was looking at him from an upstairs window, right, when he pulled off a Camaro, wasn't it? Or Thunderbird, pulled off in a Thunderbird. He remembers seeing him drive off a few years later, 14 years old, using on Edmondson Avenue in Baltimore, heroin, and that began a cycle that was very tough to get out of. One of the challenging things about that cycle, and again, Joe's my hero, so I know it's one of the challenging things about that cycle was he was incarcerated early on, and you learned about how to not get out of trouble, but get into even more trouble in incarceration, right? Tell us a little bit about how that worked.
Well, one, sometimes we, particularly in the policy-making arena, we think that we can incarcerate our way out of addiction. And I want to be real clear. Every criminal justice institution, and I've been in many, right, that I have ever been in, my drugs of choice were heroin and cocaine. My mode of usage was injection through a hypodermic needle. Every institution I was in, I could get a hypodermic needle and the drugs of my choice, right? So the notion that we incarcerate our way out of this is simply totally ridiculous. But the thing that absolutely has to happen is we have to make drug treatment available to people who need it at the time that it's available, right? Otherwise, what happens is you send somebody out who needs help, and the likelihood that they are going to remember to go back to treatment, or they don't do something that hurts somebody, or they hurt themselves, is relatively high. So we got to think about how we promote this notion of treatment on demand or availability.
And that's my last question, Joe, before passing it over to John, is at that turnaround moment, and this was years later. We were 14 to what? How old were you? 31. Well, to 31. And he was basically banging on the doors of a treatment program trying to get in. You had to act like you were crazy so that they would admit you. You had to act crazier than so that they would admit you. And it was because of a couple sympathetic actions, the gentleman at Baltimore City College, folks who took a liking to him and were able to open up some doors that he was. Talk about the importance of treatment and of a couple relationships in your life that finally helped you turn this around. Because it was all inside him all along. You can tell this man is a genius, and he was a genius even when he was using on Edmondson Avenue. It was already there, but some doors had to open up. Tell us about the doors that opened up.
It's, the day that I went to treatment, let's be honest, right? I did not go to treatment to stop getting high primarily, right? I went to treatment because I had 5 new criminal charges, and I was getting ready to go to jail for a long time. And Joshua said I'm smart. Well, I was smart enough to know the best chance I had to avoid going to jail was to be in treatment when I went to court, right? So that was my primary motivation, although at that point I began to be really debilitated. And this whole notion that I had a child out of wedlock, if ever I was sober, it would bother the hell out of me. So I would just have to medicate myself even more just to, put behind me the notion I had this kid I wasn't responsible for, right? So the first thing that happened was me circumventing that system. That was God getting me in there, right? That was somebody at the treatment center who realized they knew my face from the neighborhood, who got them to let me in. That was God putting that person there at that time. That's how I got in, right? And then when I started to go to court for those charges, it was about 3 months after I was in the treatment facility, and the judge said, I'm going to sentence you to 5 years, but I'm going to give you a deal. If you successfully complete this 1-year stay in drug treatment, right, I would give you a break. Now, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I'm smart enough to take that deal, right? And I haven't looked back since with a lot of support. The other key relationship, as Joshua alluded to, was the dean of the financial aid office at the community college that I eventually went back to. Because I tried to go to college. I got the GED back in the day when I was high. I don't know how I got that GED, under the influence of heroin and cocaine, but I did it, right? And then I tried to go to the community college, basically got the Pell Grant rebate money, and then I left, and then I didn't withdraw. And so at the end of my stay in treatment, as I'm getting towards the end, I go back to the community college, forgetting about that old Pell Grant experience. I was on academic suspension. And the dean said, I need you to go to the treatment center after I disclosed why I had my record like that, to ask the treatment center to give a letter that would describe my prognosis, and if he felt that it was substantive enough, he would let me back in. It just so happens, you talk about faith and faith. We sat down, this is an older white guy, right? There's no way he could be alive now, that's how old he was, right? As we were talking, and he asked me, well, why the hell was your record like that? I'm saying, man, I was addicted to heroin and cocaine. I could not help myself. I was sick. He said, can you help me with something, right? I said, what? His son was on drugs. But because he was in academia, he did not feel like he could personally talk to other people because it was something that was not kosher in his family, right? So because he knew of my experience, he was willing to disclose it to me. And in exchange, he said, if you make my dean's list, I will take those F's off your transcripts, insert W's for withdrawal, give you a clean slate in terms of your GPA, right? And I took him up on that deal. The dumb thing is, I ended up going to the community college for accounting, was the top student in the accounting program, and then realized with my criminal record, none of you in this room would let me count your money, so I ended up in human services.
So, but that moment started with someone who took a chance enough to have the spark of a relationship, to be in the same room and have a conversation with Joe, this dean, and then you come to find out that it was not only this man pouring into Joe, but it was Joe pouring into this man and his son. That man was broken and needed healing and needed help, and Joe was able to fulfill that role and has now gone on to found this wonderful organization, to write legislation for the Maryland state legislators to advise our president and just be a hero to us all. This is a model. This is how it works. Pastor Hunter said earlier that healing is not a one-time thing. Healing is communities walking together.
Could you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Can you say a prayer for our other ex-offenders right now?
That's right. We got to get them back on the right track right here. So with that, John Richmond, I know you had a few questions for Joe and kind of connecting up this issue as we conclude, but I'll pass it over to you, my friend. Yeah.
Thanks. Joe, I love your story, and as we've talked in the past, you were telling me about, again, how your wife saw beyond sort of the labels. We're talking about how you see beyond the labels of some of the people you help, creating a new narrative. I was wondering, can you give us some insights about how we can help see beyond the labels that society and culture put on our victims, where they label them as tarnished or spoiled or damaged, or even perhaps more challenging, how we put labels on the traffickers who are also created in the image of God and whom he deeply loves, and they come out as felons and sex offenders with lots of labels.
Yeah, I just look at, Dr. Bello, and if you saw her walking down the street, she looks stunning, right? You would never know without talking to her journey, and so how do we, not make judgments about people and what they have gone through before we get to know them. And I know sometimes it's difficult when if you're a victim of crime or if you're a victim of trafficking, to forgive the person who's done the harm to you. But what I always try to think back to is when that person was a little person, when that person first came into the world, right? Things happen over the course of that person's life that dictate some of the things we see in terms of their behavior as adults. And I often think, my son is a graduate of Morgan State University. He graduated last May, right? He graduated from the School of Engineering. He's an engineer. He's got a job. He's so tight. Now he done moved out. He done forgot who helped him get through college, right? But if he fell short and he took somebody's life, or he was a perpetrator of human trafficking, he's still my son, right? So I gotta acknowledge that he did some wrong things, but am I gonna go visit him in jail? Am I gonna pray with him? Am I gonna try to connect him to things that will allow him to live whatever life he has left? Absolutely. So the notion that we have these people in our community, right? We're not shipping them off in a space shuttle somewhere. They're going to reside. The average sentence of people who are incarcerated is between 3.5 and 4 years, right, overall, right? So the reality of the majority of the people who are incarcerated are going to be released. And do we marginalize them so much that they then continue on a path of destruction, or do we acknowledge the wrong that they did, faith, right, resurrection, and give them an opportunity to sort of like get back on the right path? But we also got to be respectful of, you know, the pain that they cause in other people. So it's a part of that whole healing, again, going back to this whole notion of pastoral counseling, where you get victims and perpetrators together sometimes, right? There's some really encouraging stories around people who've done those kind of things, that kind of work. And the faith community, I think, plays an integral role. I actually don't know any other institution that is as powerful or influential in that space and that conversation as folks in the faith community.
So there is good food and good drink right outside those doors. So between this audience and their reception, one last quick question. What is the one thing you would leave everybody with, the one idea about the intersection between civil rights and human trafficking?
You know, we are all human beings, right? At any given moment, God could create space for something to happen to or with us that we did not intend to happen, right? And so how should we prepare ourselves for the moment when, you know, everybody's going to expire. Everybody in this room is going to expire at some particular point in time, right? The likelihood that we're going to have something tragic happen to us or someone that's in our family or in our community, it just exists. That's the reality, right? So how do we as a society, right, how do we prepare ourselves for the very worst of who we are as human beings and for the very best of who we are? And how do we acknowledge the fact that at any given moment, we could switch from one place in life that's not so healthy to a place that is kind of healthy? And how do we acknowledge that the people in between, all of us need help and guidance and support? And if I didn't have people like that in my life, if people had turned their back on me, right, can you imagine the likelihood that I'd be standing here with you all having this conversation? Do you think the likelihood that I would have a relationship with Joshua, that I would be in a place where the president came to my organization and stood with me and hugged my mom, right? That's the possibility of resurrection when we don't give up faith and hope in the people who live in our society.
Joe, you're a model of faith and hope. A round of applause for Joe.